Nietzsche's critique of socialism and his critique of capitalism are intimately related. They are in some sense two expressions of the same criticism of modernity, because he sees the same underlying force driving socialism as he does capitalism, which is, broadly speaking, utilitarianism. The idea that reducing suffering for the greatest many ought to be the moral good of mankind, as well as what he's called the theoretical approach to life, which is the notion that our moral ideas can or even ought to be realized in the political sphere. And above all, this conception of man as a homo economicus. The essential nature of man in post-Enlightenment modernity is increasingly put into terms of his wants and needs, of his costs and his benefits, of happiness or unhappiness as assessed according to material well-being. Unlike many conservatives, therefore, Nietzsche's attack on socialism has very little to do with whether or not a market system actually attends to the wants and needs of the populace at large better than a centrally planned system. I mean, in some sense, it might be even worse if it's better at it, right? Because for him, it's sort of a moot question, though. As he points out in the section, A Glance at the State, it requires a value judgment to determine which state of affairs is the most useful or the most preferable. And, that utility is not an obvious quantity, right? It's, in some sense, it has a qualitative element that we have to bring to bear our value judgments on. And this is now to be determined in democratic systems according to the majority. And while the majority, you could argue, ends up putting forward standards of utility or usefulness that are nonsensical or unpalatable to you, in some sense, value judgments are always based on perspective. The very essence of the problem is that there's no objective standard for what constitutes a correct perspective or a correct value judgment. And so if socialism didn't satisfy the desires of the greatest many, then the greatest many would not be clamoring for it. It's a proof in and of itself that socialism is the end, that the greatest good for the greatest many is driving toward. And in fact, Nietzsche thinks that once we sanction these judgments of utility, of the theoretical approach to life, the theoretical approach to politics, which means a theoretical approach to the state, in which the state could do anything. And this idea of man's needs as strictly economic, right? The homo economicus, that once you accept this course of ideas, socialism becomes inevitable. And since it is inevitable, it is a necessary end for capitalism that it always drives at. It's in some sense inseparable from capitalism. Socialism is always the fruit at the end of capitalism's maturation. And so understanding Nietzsche's critique of socialism is impossible without understanding his criticism of capitalism. So if you didn't catch that episode, Nietzsche Contra Capitalism, I'd recommend going back and listening. But we're going to start with a reading of a passage from Daybreak that will serve as a segue from that critique of the capitalists and his critique of the rich and the bourgeoisie who call themselves liberals, right? That's how he characterizes them, which is a class of people that certainly exists even today, pretty much in every suburban neighborhood around every city. It's going to be a segue from his critique of them to this critique of the socialists. And this criticism, in some sense, is simply a reiteration of one of the points that we looked at in the critique of capitalism. But it nevertheless points to something very serious that Nietzsche asserts about the nature of man once he becomes perceived as the homo economicus, and the deepest flaw of any system that treats with man on those grounds. This is Daybreak 204, quote, Danae and the god of gold. Whence arises this excessive impatience in our day, which turns men into criminals, even in the circumstances which would be more likely to bring about the contrary tendency? What induces one man to use false weights, another to set his house on fire after having insured it for more than its value, a third to take part in counterfeiting, while 3/4 of our upper classes indulge in legalized fraud and suffer from the pangs of conscience that follow speculation and dealings on the stock exchange? What gives rise to all this? It is not real want, for their existence is by no means precarious. Perhaps they have even enough to eat and drink without worrying, but they are urged on day and night by a terrible impatience at seeing their wealth pile up so slowly, and by an equally terrible longing and love for these heaps of gold. In this impatience and love, however, we see reappear once more that fanaticism of the desire for power which was stimulated in former times by the belief that we were in the possession of truth, a fanaticism which bore such beautiful names that we could dare to be inhuman with a good conscience, burning Jews, heretics, and good books, and exterminating entire cultures superior to ours, such as those of Peru and Mexico. The means of this desire for power are changed in our day, but the same volcano is still smoldering. Impatience and intemperate love call for their victims, and what was once done for the love of God is now done for the love of money, i.e., for the love of that which at present affords us the highest feeling of power and a good conscience. End quote. Very interesting passage, because Nietzsche still has not formulated the will to power idea, but you can tell he is just on the edge of formulating it, and he sees it's like the puzzle that would later come out in Genealogy of Morality, right, of determining some sort of moral psychological theory to explain all of human actions and human history. And so you have this issue of good and bad conscience, which he addresses in Genealogy of Morality. How does that fit in with power as this fundamental thing, the smoldering volcano beneath all, human expressions of human action? What does it all mean? In any case, so that's the interesting aspect of this passage, because it's another preliminary step on determining the will to power. If we analyze the title, Danae and the God of Gold, Danae is the daughter of the king of Argos. Remember from our study of the Peloponnesian War, Argos is on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It's near to Sparta. And in one of the Greek myths of antiquity, Danae is visited by the god Zeus, and he disguises himself as a shower of gold, and she mates somehow with this shower of gold, and she becomes pregnant with the hero Perseus. So the title, Danae and the God of Gold, you have this Hellenic princess, this mythic figure who mates with a god in the form of a literal shower of gold, and they produce offspring. The Hellenes, right? That's sort of a symbol in Nietzsche's thought. They're real flesh and blood people. They have this unity of inner character and outer action. So that's what Danae symbolizes, real humanity. And we've mated with what? Gold. Gold arrives to us as the avatar of a god, right? Gold has become our god. And why is that? Because the thing that affords us the highest feeling of power is now economic success, and that is now where all of our love and worship goes. And so to bring in Marx here, I think there's a wonderful article by Ian Wright that I'll link in the show notes on Marx's idea that capital itself is not just like a tool we use or something, but something akin to an entity with its own logic and its own goals to which we are subject. And so he calls it, therefore, a literal god. Capital is like an alien entity, something external to us which we have to worship and follow the dictates of. And I'll just, to explain this in my own way, we might simply appeal to what we discussed in the Nietzschean Critique of Capitalism about incentive structures. A great deal is made about our freedom, right? The maximizing of our choices within capitalism. But in fact, the market itself has almost nothing to do with free choice, because it incentivizes behavior along a predictable and necessary set of inputs of rewards and punishment. And while some people might have more freedom to ignore those rewards and punishments, right? The degree that freedom exists, it either corresponds to their willingness to be poor, i.e. to have virtually no power in society and be at the bottom of the hierarchy, which most people are not willing to do, or to the degree of capital that they hold, right? The more money that you have, the more you can sort of spend needlessly and not worry about your own survival. And so, therefore, we see how the selection mechanisms work, because those who hold the most capital will be able to generate capital in the most efficient way, i.e. providing for some desire at the most profit to themselves and at the least cost to the consumer of the desire, and so on and so forth. And so for you to have some measure of freedom from sort of that desire production and exchange of desire for capital, you have to already have, in some sense, either inherited the ability to be free of it or already played that game, played through that incentive structure so effectively that you can then be free of it. Or you just have to be willing to, I have a very close friend who lives in a van, right? He just wants to be a musician, not work the 9-to-5 job, not do the rat race or anything, and so he doesn't. Sometimes it's tough on him, right? But that's the price of freedom. And so over time, right, when we iterate across millions of people, what we find is that for most, the reason why that's maybe an interesting anecdote for me to even bring up, and it's because it's not a normal thing you hear, right? Most people actually start to make the same choices over and over and over again in the market. Most people just get the 9-to-5 job. They get the hourly wage job. They slot themselves into some place in the market which has been determined as valuable, not by any one person's free choice, but by the logic of capital efficiency. And so we're all increasingly constrained to those incentives of capital, even though you can say in theory people could choose not to follow those incentives. The vast majority will, and most people have a very limited amount of choice that they have and how much they can resist those incentives. And so Nietzsche is saying money is our God. And if you agree with Ian Wright's interpretation, he's sort of agreeing with Marx there. And when that God mates with humanity, what is the offspring like, right? What is the homo economicus like in his character? Well, he's nothing like Perseus, right? Nietzsche contrasts one who is born of the God of money with the men of past ages. And what does he say? I mean, they felt themselves to be in possession of an undisputed truth. And there are horrible things that those men did, right? Like the burning of heretics, exterminating entire cultures. If you ever read about how Cortez behaved when he arrived in the New World, how he intentionally lies and manipulates the native population, he goes back on his word. And when he executes them, he burns them, he executes them in horrific ways, tortures people to death. And it's not very pleasant to read about. But Nietzsche says, it's very subtle, the way that he puts this forward. He says these cultures were superior to ours. It's an interesting comment, and probably says something more about Nietzsche's love of blood sacrifices and paganism than any sort of anti-colonial agenda, because obviously from our perspective, the Aztecs weren't very nice people either. And, just as my own personal criticism of what Nietzsche is saying here, the idea that the Spaniards weren't worshiping gold would also be a little silly to put forward. There's actually that one story about a Taino chief who led a guerrilla war against the Spaniards, and he said that the god that they worship was gold. But let's just leave aside all these complications and our personal and moral feelings in the matter. Cortez thought he was in possession of absolute truth. I think that's the important point. He had an absolute code of morals, which he felt was above any and all earthly concerns. That the transcendent morality, the supernatural basis of the religious mode of being, which obtained before the liberalization of Europe, that provided man with this other basis, something other than earthly advantage or earthly pleasure to seek in life. Obviously, when it comes to Christianity, Nietzsche thinks that this was a disastrous development for mankind because the Christian valuation of life puts our attention on the afterlife, and it puts our attention on the state of our immortal soul, on the unworldly, right? But nevertheless, it provided that transcendent goal, a goal which is beyond the preservation of ourselves as we are, a goal beyond our own comfort or pleasure in the here and now. It set our eye beyond the horizon of mundane concerns. And so what does Nietzsche say has happened now? Well, God has died, as we've discussed in many other places on the podcast, and the Enlightenment is here. Science has advanced to the point where we now have ever more subtle control over our environment, and the power of industrial production has revolutionized the economy. And we've broken down the barriers of caste. We've abolished this belief in divine sanction of certain individuals to rule. And so that absolute unquestionable authority no longer exists within our minds. And Nietzsche believes, therefore, that utility is naturally the thing that will gain ascendance as the most important value of society in the wake of that. That utility is served at the moment by the system of capitalism. That is, it satisfies the most desires the most efficiently. And seeing no essential difference between themselves and the people in the top rungs of society, and seeing now that it's possible to change the social fabric to benefit the ever greater majority, right? Eventually that liberalization of the market and the church and the political sphere will give way to those demands for more social welfare, and that the liberalization of the market will inevitably transform into something beyond liberalism. That there is nothing to stand in the way of this logic of impinging on market freedom to create well-being if your only goal is the greatest comfort and safety of the greatest number of people. Because why is freedom in and of itself valuable? People want freedom in order to attain well-being, in order to gain pleasure and avoid displeasure. So while a free market may have increased those things for a time, eventually we'll see how moving beyond the free market will increase that value, right? So this is, again, the important point is the underlying value that's driving the system, not necessarily the ideological nuances or contrivances of the various different forms of socialism or theories of socialism or capitalism, right? Nietzsche's critiquing the value underneath it. Now, I could see the objection from the socialists that they are aimed at some sort of transcendent goal for mankind that is beyond utility. However, I don't think Nietzsche would agree with that. And he would say that there is a difference between his own conception of what a transcendent goal is and the utopian vision of the socialists. What Nietzsche wishes for, and that both Christianity and pagan religions gave us, is a transformative goal. These are systems that attempt to inculcate a sense of dissatisfaction with the way that one is now, and with the aim of perfecting mankind. Even the term perfection is loaded, however, because perfection is not a state that any system can ever reach. It's not something that you reach, it's a direction, right? And notice I said perfecting mankind, not perfecting the system itself. Now, the utopian ideal of achieving this, perfect utilitarian system, on the other hand, that's not a goal that involves transformation for us, but it's about preservation. It's about finding the most satisfying status quo and preserving it. It's a goal that will be inevitably opposed to the infliction of any amount of suffering or death, perhaps as a cost of the advancement of mankind, and will always opt for the safer option, right? Even to save a single life. So Nietzsche's idea of a transcendent goal is that which is beyond momentary pleasure or advantage, whereas this theoretical approach to life merely attempts to extend the momentary pleasure as long as possible into a perpetual pleasure, right? Expand this sense of comfort or safety to the most people. But there's a problem with that. Nietzsche suggests it in the passage we read from before. He says that when we examine those people who are already comfortable in society, who have attained enough wealth to escape from the feeling of precarity, they do not find that sense of freedom or contentment that we always imagine is just over the horizon. If only we manage to solve all our economic problems, right? This is reflected, I think, in the modern world, that in the countries with the most economic prosperity, we find the highest rates of anxiety and depression. And the result of this, as Nietzsche suggested in one of the passages we looked at in the Critique of Capitalism, is that the acquisition of more wealth, it becomes their strategy in the war with ennui, as he puts it. Machiavelli says something very similar, and that men never feel secure in their property. They don't feel secure in the property that they have, except by acquiring more. But the result of all this is that we acquire enough resources to survive comfortably. And supposing we have no transcendent goal in mind, we then imagine that acquiring more simply must be the point. Because we want to preserve what we have, and we can never really feel secure in what we have except by acquiring more. And that's why, as Nietzsche mentions in the passage we read today, there's a tension that drives even our most successful and well taken care of people today, right? And this tension drives them to criminality, to fraud, to embezzlement, and so on. And that's why Nietzsche says 3/4 of the upper classes engage in legalized fraud, or in the risky game of speculation on the stock market, because it's their only way of introducing some sort of goal or risk or movement into their lives, because ultimately man does not find happiness inside contentment, inside a state of affairs where all of his economic needs are met, right? That's always empty, and so we always keep seeking to fill that void. And as Schopenhauer called it, that's the pendulum between pain and boredom, represented here in economic life. That boredom, the deeper sense of boredom that the French call ennui, it only manifests all the more strongly the more contentment that we have. And when we have no goal beyond contentment, this drives the insatiable hunger for wealth among those who have nothing else to do. And so that, in Nietzsche's view, is the downfall of the entire attempt to construct a state based on well-being, or measured purely against the standard of the pleasure or displeasure of its inhabitants, that pleasure or displeasure, like the state itself, are only means, and that there is a strange and terrible thing that happens in attempting to make them ends. When the goal of our morality becomes pleasure and the goal of the state becomes the state itself, right? The thing that maintains that pleasure. And so Nietzsche writes in a passage in The Gay Science entitled The Goal of Science, an aphorism that we've looked at before. It reads like a direct refutation of the preachers of utilitarianism today. Nietzsche writes, quote, "What? The ultimate goal of science is to create the most pleasure possible to man and the least possible pain. But what if pleasure and pain should be so closely connected that he who wants the greatest possible amount of the one must also have the greatest possible amount of the other? The Stoics at least believed it was so, and they were consistent when they wished to have the least possible pleasure, in order to have the least possible pain from life. At present, also, you still have the choice. Either the least possible pain, in short, painlessness, and after all, socialists and politicians of all parties could not honorably promise more to their people, or the greatest possible amount of pain, as the price of the growth of a fullness of refined delights and enjoyments rarely tasted hitherto. If you decide for the former, if you therefore want to depress and minimize man's capacity for pain, well, you must also depress and minimize his capacity for enjoyment. In fact, one can further the one as well as the other goal by science." End quote. So it's an interesting theory that reducing pain also reduces happiness. That by basing your entire system on painlessness as a means of measuring well-being, you'll also minimize man's pleasure in life. That pleasure and displeasure are not opposites, but they're required for one another. And notice Nietzsche says that science could be used toward either ends, which brings about a deeper issue. This view that science can answer moral problems, it tends to ignore the values questions beneath how we approach those problems. And that someone with a Nietzschean framework might take serious issue with the elimination of suffering as the goal of our social system. I should point out that Nietzsche's criticism here, it's not really attacking a straw man, because such moral theories have always been prominent, and they find purchase even today. I've mentioned people like Sam Harris and Steven Pinker, who basically offer nothing beyond what Jeremy Bentham said hundreds of years before them, that science can find the answers to our moral problems. Harris says it's scientifically provable that we ought to aim at the goal of what he calls well-being. Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, more or less makes the case that because all of the metrics that measure what we might call well-being have improved, including safety, overall level of freedom from want, etc., therefore the only rational thing to do is to support the Enlightenment values of hundreds of years ago and have faith in this system as it is, right? Pinker especially seems hostile to any goal for mankind that might involve transformation or exceeding the limits of humanity. He rails against both Nietzsche's Overman and against the Soviet Union's New Soviet Man, which he alleges was somewhat inspired by Nietzsche's Übermensch, which is somewhat of an interesting idea that I hope to discuss a bit more. In any case, Harris and Pinker would mostly be called defenders of capitalism. So you might wonder, how does this criticism apply and become relevant to Nietzsche's understanding of socialism? The socialists ultimately aim at the abolition of property and aim at a goal beyond the current market system, whereas Harris and Pinker want to preserve it. Well, we might first of all notice that Nietzsche argues in the passage that we read from that, in fact, there's nothing greater that the socialists could promise their adherents but a more painless society. And so, again, it's an issue of the value underneath the ideology, right? Not the surface-level ideological disagreements. Nietzsche sees that this is yet another attempt to more perfectly tune our political and economic system to fall into line with our utilitarian quest for well-being. And so the socialist goal of a propertyless society is based on the exact same set of values that Harris and Pinker put forward. It's simply that the socialists point out all the limitations of the laissez-faire system, that the capitalist system has all these faults in achieving this ideal, whereas Harris and Pinker focus on maybe their angle is more the suffering that might be created by experimenting with new systems or attempting to violently transition out of it. And so, of course, for my part, I would argue we don't really live in either one. We don't really live in a free market nor in a socialist economy, but in some sort of strange utilitarian hybrid. Anyway, Nietzsche echoes these thoughts many years later in the book Beyond Good and Evil, and this is where he writes in section 225, quote, "Whether it is hedonism or pessimism, utilitarianism or eudaimonism, all these ways of thinking that measure the value of things in accordance with pleasure and pain, which are mere epiphenomena and wholly secondary, are ways of thinking that stay in the foreground, and naivetes on which everyone conscious of creative powers and an artistic conscience will look down, not without derision and not without pity. You want, if possible, and there is no more insane if possible, to abolish suffering. And it really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible, that makes his destruction desirable. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far? That tension of the soul in unhappiness which cultivates its strength, its shudders face to face with great ruin, its inventiveness and courage in enduring, persevering, interpreting, and exploiting suffering, and whatever has been granted to it of profundity, secret, mask, spirit, cunning, greatness, was it not granted to it through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? In man, creature and creator are united. In man there is material, fragment, excess, clay, dirt, nonsense, chaos. But in man there is also creator, form giver, hammer hardness, spectator divinity, and seventh day. Do you understand this contrast? And that your pity is for the creature in man, for what must be formed, broken, forged, torn, burnt, made incandescent and purified, that which necessarily must and should suffer. And our pity, do you not comprehend for whom our converse pity is, when it resists your pity as the worst of all pamperings and weaknesses? Thus it is pity versus pity. But to say it once more, there are higher problems than all problems of pleasure, pain, and pity, and every philosophy that stops with them is a naivete." End quote. So his criticism here is not limited to utilitarianism, but to any measure of the worth of things based on pleasure and pain, because as means, these things cannot be measures. And there's an interesting sort of play on words when he says that it would make man worthy of destruction, or it would make his destruction desirable if we were to adopt this as a goal to get rid of suffering. And he says it would be an end. So the double entendre there is, by making pleasure and pain an end instead of the means, it's also a literal end, as in a death or the destruction of mankind or of mankind's happiness, right? That through your quest for preserving happiness for the greatest many, you'll actually destroy it for everyone. He says that this is the discipline that has elevated humanity in every instance so far, is suffering. That this is the great paradox of the human condition in some sense. That the very thing that we think we're seeking, which is our contentment and well-being and safety, is the very thing that makes us weaker and actually does not bring us happiness. And the very thing that we're trying to overcome, which is challenge, suffering, strife, we're actually happiest when we're in the process of overcoming it. And we're made better when we're in the process of overcoming it. But as soon as we're done overcoming it, we go into this state of degenerating again, right? And so the most important aspect of this, I think, is when he splits mankind into creature and creator. And I think this is purely it's a pedagogical tool. Don't take too much metaphysically out of that, right? That our hedonic assessments of well-being only focus their attention on the creature, right? Such assessments of our well-being based on plugging in all the environmental factors, food, water, etc. Those are all our animal needs, we might say. It's treating man, as Dostoevsky brilliantly put it in Notes from Underground, as a piano key. Something that just simply needs a series of inputs, like a machine, right? We might even be able to prove to ourselves with math and science that all we need are these inputs to be fulfilled, and by all accounts that should mean happiness. And yet what Nietzsche sees is something very similar to Dostoevsky, that there is some desire in man, some drive, some will, which cannot be satisfied with the mere input of animal needs. And that what this is in some sense the desire within us, which always wishes to transcend what it is now and go beyond our current limitations. Nietzsche calls it the part that is creator and not creature. And there's also a very interesting thing there, right, in that he's sort of containing within man both, there's that famous Da Vinci painting of, God giving life to Adam, right? He's saying both of those are within you. And of course they are, because we are beings that came out of nature. That's the creature aspect. But we are also the creator. We invented the idea of God, right? That came out of our own psychology. And that was actually a means of, advancing or elevating mankind in some way, in spite of its pitfalls. And so in his broader canon of ideas, we can identify this creative aspect of mankind with the will to power, that desire of life to strive to overcome itself, right? And so Nietzsche's problem with socialism is that we find utility at the base of the project yet again. Its desire for self-advantage and the attainment of a consciousness that this can be achieved on the level of the entire class, right? That's really what separates socialism from capitalism. And that's what Marx says will drive the proletariat to inevitably revolt, is this coming into their class consciousness. And this is something that Nietzsche talks about as well in the gay science passage, The Genius of the Species, right? Nietzsche thinks perhaps this collective aspect to consciousness is maybe even more natural to us than perhaps Marx even thinks it is. That the individual subsuming their advantage under the weight of the collective advantage is as old as time, and it has to do with the fact that the grammar of our thinking, the language in which our consciousness interprets, perceives, and judges, is by its very nature sort of tied in with this collective network rather than an individual thing. That conceptually the world we live in is collective. But in any case, I think you could find the idea in both Nietzsche and Marx that once you introduce this idea of utility, right, going from individual utility to a perception that there is a collective utility, that seems like a necessary and inevitable step or inevitable progression. And as Marx points out, it's not just going to be some sort of abstract or moralized attainment of class consciousness. The reason why we attain class consciousness is because we perceive at the level of the collective that gives us the most power, right? So you could say the earliest collectives that existed in this way were tribal structures and then nation states or empires. And that beyond this, you'll have an international proletariat that will take the collective perception of what its advantage is to the next step in the next order of associations or collectivity. The reason why this process seems to be inevitable or necessary, we might make a Nietzschean argument based on what he discusses in the Gay Science, section 21. It's because of the virtues that we've been enculturated to have and how virtues use us. He says that virtues such as industriousness or obedience, justice, and so on, they're evaluated not selflessly or disinterestedly or dispassionately, as we might like to believe, but with regard for how these virtues benefit the public or society at large, benefit the collective at large that we're a part of. And oftentimes these virtues harm the individual who lives by them. But that isn't because they're selfless, right? It's because the level of selfishness is just at a higher order, right? It's because the power that selects for the virtues is the community rather than any one individual. And so it's the community that's being selfish. It's not as though the community is simply made of selfless individuals who don't care for their own benefit, right? And so our entire moral orientation has been nurtured by what's useful to the community, how any one of us can become instrumental to the good of the collective, and therefore European morality, at least, Nietzsche says, has become herd morality. The morality of the collective is what gives content and tone to the voice in our conscience, right? This morality turns us towards, more and more, it turns us towards utilitarianism as it comes out in our conscience, in our moral intuition. And Nietzsche writes that, quote, "What is really praised when virtues are praised is their instrumental nature," end quote. And that in praising and elevating these virtues, the individual allows himself to be made into a function of the whole. That's something that he consents to because he sees the advantage in it for him as part of a broader collective than his own. So for Nietzsche, this is a very natural and inevitable process, and thus socialism appears as the necessary next step of that when you take away things like, for example, like we talked about, God is dead, right? So you no longer have these religious bonds. The nation state is breaking down. It's no longer seen as legitimate because it's no longer based on this absolute authority, right? And so increasingly, as you take those bonds away, or, going all the way back to the medieval bondsmen of feudal times, right? The absolute state in Europe of, these social duties and obligations. If we're measuring everything with this absolute measuring stick of pleasure or displeasure, right, as you take all those other things away, suddenly there's no internal logic for why you would more identify with somebody of the upper class in your own nation rather than with somebody of your same class, of another proletarian in, one country away from you. And so this is why Nietzsche identifies socialists, egalitarians, and anarchists as all essentially offspring of Christianity, because it's those same collective virtues that were nurtured by Christianity, and in spite of Marx's opposition to Christianity, all it is the same content actually turned up to the extreme, right? That central value of pity and compassion and equality of all before the eyes of God, except now there's no God, right? And now all of those moral constrictions of the church and duties and obligations of religious, based on superstition and metaphysical beliefs, are no longer there. You've simply maximized the values of pity and so on. Now, I should say a word here, since I've been mentioning Marx a lot. It occurs to me I should really address whether Nietzsche is actually really addressing Marx, because he never directly goes after Marx in his writing. And this has led some to claim that Nietzsche never read Marx and was attacking only the non-Marxist socialists. We have to take ourselves back to the cultural context of that time, of the 19th century, where socialism was a huge, influential political movement, but there were many kinds of socialism. And Marxism was by no means what someone automatically thought of when they thought of socialism. It's also a time before socialist policies have really been implemented on any grand scale. So the idea that Marxism would be the orienting ideology of socialism when it did finally get implemented was not really known yet. However, I think it is false, as Thomas Brouwer's work has proved, that Nietzsche never read Marx. That's simply a false claim. In fact, in Lange's History of Materialism, the dialectical materialism of the Marxists is included and had chunks of Marx quotations. We know for a fact that Nietzsche read Lange's work closely and it had an impact on his thought. There are also maybe a dozen other sources where Nietzsche encountered Marx, by the way, but the book by Lange is just one example. And so, that being said, it's wrong to say that Nietzsche wasn't responding to Marx. I think it's a slippery kind of argument to maybe make Nietzsche and Marx seem like they're in more agreement than they really are. Because, Marx also attacks other schools of socialism. That's what socialists love to do more than anything else, is attack each other and critique one another and gatekeep who gets to be a socialist. Anyway, even though it's wrong to say that Nietzsche wasn't responding to Marx, and that, it's wrong to say, oh, Nietzsche was just criticizing other socialists the way Marx did, and they would have been friends. No, I think Nietzsche and Marx had very serious differences in their thought. But it's correct that he was not specifically responding to Marx. That's perhaps the best way to think about it, that this is not a critique of Marxism. It's a critique of socialism as sort of an amorphous, broader movement in society. And I think we can shed some light on it by looking at it this way, that Nietzsche, he isn't looking at socialism based on the esoteric theories of these bourgeois socialist writers who want to direct the course of the revolution according to their own agenda, to their, in accord with their social ideas or whatever. Nietzsche is familiar with all these various socialist theories, But what he really addresses is not any one of them specifically. He perceives this general movement towards socialism as something that's driven by this desire for material comfort of the proletariat. And in a way, he's not too dissimilar to Marx here, who criticized those who preached socialism out of like that social moralism. And Marx really believed that he was pursuing scientific socialism, that all the other forms of socialism were unscientific, right? That's also very in keeping with Nietzsche's approach during the period of the gay science. So Marx believed that his version of socialism and, eventually communism, that this alone would be the scientific approach. And so it's based on material realities, right? Both what Nietzsche and what Marx argue is what they're saying is based on the material reality and on what benefits the various classes of society. It's not based on a moral argument. The only question is, in Marx's case, when will the proletariat come into the consciousness of what benefits their class? I think Nietzsche thinks about it very similarly. Moralism is a surface and a skin. The real thing driving the revolution is a desire among the masses for their own betterment. What some wonky anarcho-syndicalist writer said is not the reason for the revolution, but a symptom of the forces in society that are driving that revolution into existence. And as we know from history, when revolutions happen, a lot of the intellectuals get killed off anyway. So socialism for Nietzsche is a driving instinct, right? It's a tendency. It's a collective valuation based on class advantage. And so Marx is certainly included in this criticism. He doesn't get to escape just because Marx is self-aware enough to criticize the other socialists on the same point. But the point I want to drive home is that the ideological distinctions of how we define socialism, it doesn't really matter to Nietzsche. He sees socialism as a collective psychological reality. It's not an ideology to be debated. Now, for Nietzsche, socialism doesn't solve the problem of making man into an economic animal. In fact, socialism exacerbates the problem, doesn't it? Because if the socialists are correct, and contentment and well-being can be extended to everyone in society, or at least the maximum number possible, we'll only have gifted this sense of ennui to the maximum number of people. We'll have deprived the maximum number of people of the most possibilities for pleasure also, by depriving them of pain and struggle. And then further, you'll have taken the pursuit of property from them as an avenue of finding that sense of power or combating their ennui, which is something they had before, unsatisfying as it is. You take that away and left them with pure utility, with perhaps a vague sense that they're part of some process of creating the most well-being that mankind has ever experienced, right? The Soviet slogan, "Our goal is the happiness of all mankind." Simply by my participation in the system, I'm part of this grand project. And, perhaps we might imagine people could take some sort of joy in this. It's worth noting, however, that what the socialists often claimed, this certainly applies to the Marxists as well, is that their real aim is not actually the absence of pain per se, or even economic equality, or even a utopia. That the goal, the real ends, is simply the freedom of the proletariat. That perhaps these things will follow from their freedom, right? Well-being and pleasure and so on and so forth, but that the control of the productive forces of society by the producing classes is really the sole goal, and that the fetters imposed upon the proletariat, they're mostly artificial, they're imposed by society, by power relationships, and that without these, they'll be free to direct their energies to whatever goals the sort of good of the proletariat decides upon. And so the goal isn't really well-being itself, or to determine what a utilitarian paradise will look like, because as we've pointed out, that's sort of a perspectival issue, and everyone will have their own conception of utility. It's simply to allow the conception of utility that is going to be generated by the productive forces in collective control of the means of production, right? And so you could argue that well-being is a thing that might be generated, but it's not the goal. Or that maybe well-being itself, once it's generated, is still only a means, because really the reason why we want that contentment and security is because a certain amount of security or well-being might be required for mankind to be able to pursue higher and more self-enriching pleasures, right? Like the arts and the sciences or what have you. However we approach the argument, Nietzsche, I think, still has a problem with all of this. He discusses this in The Gay Science in Book 5, and Book 5 is actually closer to the time he was writing Beyond Good and Evil than it is to the time in which he wrote the rest of the Gay Science. But it's a very instructive passage which reflects Nietzsche's cynicism. I could put it more poetically, it's his tragic outlook regarding the state and man's social life, which kind of sets him eternally at odds with socialists, I think, of all stripes, including the Marxists. And so in this passage, he takes aim not at just the promise of universal well-being, but of universal freedom, as achieved by a social system. So this is the Gay Science 356, quote, "The Athenian conviction, which is first observed in the epoch of Pericles, the American conviction of the present day, which wants also more and more to become a European conviction, whereby the individual is convinced that he can do almost anything, that he can play almost any role, whereby everyone makes experiments with himself, improvises, tries anew, tries with delight, whereby all nature ceases and becomes art. The Greeks, having adopted this role creed, an artist creed if you will, underwent, step by step, as is well known, a curious transformation. Not in every respect worthy of imitation. They became actual stage players, and as such they enchanted, they conquered all the world, and at last even the conqueror of the world, for the Graeculus Histrio conquered Rome, and not Greek culture, as the naive are accustomed to say." End quote. So to interject briefly, what Pericles expresses, if we recall from Thucydides, is that Athens is the academy of the pan-Hellenic world, that any man of any background can do anything, achieve anything within Athens, that their system is based on merit and not on these rigid ties of blood or privileges of certain tribes and religious prescriptions and so on and so forth, that Athens has this freedom, right? And Nietzsche says that he says it's not entirely worthy of imitation, right? Because there's something dangerous about it, because it's supremely artistic. This perspective views the various professions not as something essential to one's nature, as the law of castes might have seen things, but sort of from the opposite extreme, as mere roles into which one can slip as though an actor. And funnily enough, if we recall, that's the very thing that Plato says they can't tolerate in the ideal republic, since everyone must play only one role and play it very well. But in any case, so Nietzsche might have some criticism, Plato might have some criticism of the system of Athens, but Nietzsche also says it's praiseworthy, even though it's not totally worthy of imitation. But as he's wont to do, the tone of the passage then turns somewhat as it continues. He says, quote, "What I fear, however, and what is at present obvious, if we desire to perceive it, is that we modern men are quite on the same road already. And whenever a man begins to discover in what respect he plays a role, and to what extent he can be a stage player, he becomes a stage player. A new flora and fauna of men thereupon springs up, which cannot grow in more stable, restricted eras, or is left at the bottom, under the ban and suspicion of infamy. Thereupon the most interesting and insane periods of history always make their appearance, in which stage players, all kinds of stage players, are the real masters." End quote. I'm going to cut in on this paragraph again, and then we'll finish this passage. I just want to say that in Rome, for example, which is something Nietzsche sort of implicitly referencing here, actors were considered a lowly profession. They were considered a shameful profession, kind of on par with like prostitution, if not a little bit worse. Prostitution was also seen as somewhat shameful in ancient Rome, but being an actor, they relegated you to the sort of fringes of society. There's like feast days and religious rites where actors are not allowed to come, you can't participate, everyone except you. So, that's what Nietzsche says, where he's saying, in much of the ancient world, the stage player is relegated to the bottom and to a state of suspicion and infamy, and that the most insane periods of history are the ones in which everything just becomes a role, in which the stage player becomes the master. And we might think of how in America we say that Washington is Hollywood for ugly people, that everyone knows there's an element of being an actor, of being a stage player, of having charisma in the political sphere, of being a politician. And so Nietzsche's sort of pointing out how that our culture of celebrating actors is actually somewhat similar to the Athenian democratic period, but it carries with it this danger and unpredictability. So let's go back to the text. Quote, "Precisely thereby, another species of man is always more and more injured, and in the end made impossible. Above all the great architects, the building power is now being paralyzed. The courage that makes plans for the distant future is disheartened. There begins to be a lack of organizing geniuses. Who is there who would now venture to undertake works for the completion of which millenniums would have to be reckoned upon? The fundamental belief is dying out, on the basis of which one could calculate, promise, and anticipate the future in one's plan, and offer it as a sacrifice thereto, that in fact man has only value and significance, insofar as he is a stone in a great building, for which purpose he has first of all to be solid. He has to be a stone. Above all, not a stage player. In short, alas, this fact will be hushed up for some considerable amount of time to come. That which from henceforth will no longer be built, and can no longer be built, is a society in the old sense of the term. To build that structure, everything is lacking, above all the material. None of us are any longer material for a society. That is a truth which is seasonable at present. It seems to me a matter of indifference that, meanwhile, the most short-sighted, perhaps the most honest, and at any rate the noisiest species of men of the present day, our friends the socialists, believe, hope, dream, and above all scream and scribble almost the opposite. In fact, one already reads their watchword of the future, free society, on all tables and walls. Free society? Indeed? Indeed. But you know, gentlemen, sure enough, whereof one builds it? Out of wood and iron. Out of the famous wood and iron. And it must not even be wooden." End quote. So that last line, the wood and iron, is a famous metaphor in philosophy. It's an oxymoron, right? Think of it like a square circle or a married bachelor. It's an iron, the kind one uses to poke at a fire, but it's made of wood, which means it can't possibly suit that purpose, as wood is flammable. So Nietzsche is saying the phrase free society is the same kind of oxymoron. To speak of a free society is to speak of square circles or married bachelors. But that's the highest hope and the dream of the socialists. So his criticism here doesn't just concern itself with utility, with well-being, right, but with claims that socialism will lead to greater freedom. As to why, it's not so explicit in the passage, but we have to kind of read between the lines a little bit. We can understand it by considering what Nietzsche says is not possible anymore, given this modern idea of freedom. It's not possible to create a society in the old sense. Why? Well, because society in the old sense was based on roles, which were not mere stage roles, but which were in some sense inevitable to each person and had to be sincerely adopted. There was not this element of choosing whether or not you wanted to play the role. So, to consider one's family roles, for example, as part of the ancient Greek family, you're an individual second and member of your family first. The family endures beyond any one individual. There are far more ancestors than living members who themselves live on in this strange kind of way in your, imagination on your sacred lands, and your entire purpose in life is to ensure that there continue to be descendants. So in that old type of society, your vision is turned away from momentary advantage or your individual happiness. You sacrifice those things for a goal that is far, far in the future. That's what society in the old sense requires in order for that collective project, for that collective morality to have some goal beyond itself. That was the goal that defined the societies of old. We might think of the study of the various moralities that Zarathustra talks about, where every society has its own table of values, the means and method of its overcomings. Zarathustra says that the meaning of every culture's good and evil is like the voice of their overcomings, and that accordingly, good and evil is the most powerful thing man ever invented. This power, this collectivity, based on the sacrifice of the momentary individual pleasure to the projects of the future, sort of expanding our vision and focus. And so to make Nietzsche's argument very straightforward and blunt, for me to have a rare chance of putting Nietzsche forward with more brevity than he does himself, we're too atomized to actually create a socialist society in which everyone is allowed to be free. That's been the result of liberalization, that quite apart from this class consciousness, we've actually developed this deep sense of individualized atomization. If we recall from Nietzsche's critique of capitalism, that's another system that promises to deliver freedom to the most people. The real problem is that Nietzsche doesn't think most people have the capacity to will themselves to make those kinds of sacrifices when they're not compelled. And such a thing is not really even possible at all when the entire structure of society has been made so fluid and everything is so instrumental and utilitarian, right? In all senses of the word. And so that the promise, you shall all be free, kind of carries with it this unavoidable outcome of making everyone short-sighted and self-seeking, and that the bonds of society, these duties and obligations, are the thing that forced us to be far-sighted, and without these, we just become self-seeking, self-preservative animals. We become less capable of sacrificing ourselves and our happiness for something like the good of our ancestors or the good of our descendants, right? Which even that is something that's, I think, in the literal sense that the Greek thought about it, is very, very far from our modern consciousness now. But historically, right, the socialist regimes and the theorists have all usually insisted that the family has to be secondary to a socialist project, or even that the family structure has to be dismantled. And so it's for that reason, right? The traditional family has to be dissolved for this other system of values to become possible. But Nietzsche is questioning whether that state of affairs of quote-unquote freedom will actually arise. And that if it did, would you be able to maintain that along with a state of affairs that we could still sensibly call a society, right? Because society, in the old sense, as he points out, is based on those very roles and the unquestionability of those roles. So as we make that more of a choice, right, as we introduce more freedom in that sense, it seems like that's almost the refutation of society, which is why it's oxymoronic to talk about a free society. And so either you have this illusion of freedom within society itself, because society always requires people to be compelled or forced in some way, or you do actually, the more you maximize freedom, the more you do actually push against the bounds of what you need to have a society. And so I think the problem here goes beyond what we might even call quote-unquote individualism or quote-unquote collectivism. It's that well-being when used as a principle, meaning freedom from pain, freedom from want, or even as Nietzsche adds here, the ability to determine one's own destiny. That inevitably turns towards these momentary aims, because the goals of our momentary impulses can only be restrained by all those things that impinge on our freedom, right? And that the idea of everyone just self-regulating is a fantasy. That such a society in which everyone's impulses are allowed to be quote-unquote free, you could say it's neither individualistic or collectivistic, because it doesn't really serve the good of either one. And another way you could say it's both, because the only overarching binding principle is the well-being of all. To it, that's the will of the people, that's the happiness of all mankind, the thing that we all sublimate our will to, but everyone also wants their share of it, right? And so the political freedom never gives us the spiritual freedom that we need to seek something beyond our current limitations, because that requires sacrifice, it requires renunciation, and it might require inflicting pain on ourselves or even inflicting pain on others, right? And so on a very basic level, society requires that people be made into instruments, as Nietzsche has written elsewhere. And we've talked about it in previous episodes, that this is the horrifying revelation of history, that all civilization as it exists today is the product of exploitation and slavery, and that without these things, all the great products of human history would not exist either. All of the art, culture, literature, even science, right? We'll return to Human All Too Human, where Nietzsche touches on this aspect again. Quote, "When socialists prove that the distribution of wealth in present-day society is the consequence of countless injustices and atrocities Rejecting in summa the obligation toward anything so unjustly established, they are seeing one particular thing only. The whole past of the old culture is built on violence, slavery, deception, error. But we, the heirs of all these conditions, indeed the convergence of that whole past, cannot decree ourselves away, and cannot want to remove one particular part. The unjust frame of mind lies in the souls of the have-nots, too. They are no better than the haves, and have no special moral privilege, for at some point their forefathers were haves, too. We do not need forcible new distributions of property, but rather gradual transformations of attitude. Justice must become greater in everyone, and the violent instinct weaker." End quote. So, obviously from that ending there, Nietzsche is not yet in full embrace of the will to power as this preferable principle in which to base one's actions, and even wishes to make violent instincts of mankind weaker, suggesting that would be a good thing, right? Something which we can't really imagine later Nietzsche saying. But aside from that interesting difference in the way he would evaluate things from this period to his later period, we can see another attack on the idea of a quote-unquote free society, insofar as every society is structured as it is based on past relationships of power and wealth that were themselves unjust, and that we ourselves have been shaped by, and that we ourselves are therefore the product of that injustice, and we can't change any one part of it without changing who and what we are. And that, once again, Nietzsche has, he's characterized the socialists and the super rich as not essentially different in any respect in terms of their inner content, that all modern people have this sort of tension and hunger in our soul, this dissatisfaction with modern life and the values that we've been taught that we have to pursue. And so this is the socialists' call for an upheaval, right? Searching for something beyond the power relationships that they think have spoiled man, that idea that goes back to Rousseau. But the wealthy, meanwhile, are also frantically sort of gambling away all their money on the stock market and turning to fraud and embezzlement, as a means of escaping from the contentment that they've created for themselves, right? So to go back to the content of the first passage we looked at this week, everyone's trying to escape from this contentment that we're creating, whether they consciously understand it or not. Now, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this development for Nietzsche is that this abstract moral idea of utility cannot remain purely abstract. The abstract is not motivating in and of itself, and it's probably not in the inclination or even the capacities of most people to value purely in the realm of abstraction, in spite of what Kant might think about human beings, or to be simply satisfied to live by a self-imposed principle, in that intelligible world that Plato and Socrates love so much. No, so we need an image, we need an embodiment, we need an incarnation. We have to make that abstract reified and impose the power of that ideal in the physical world. And so this moral idea that we've outlined, that Nietzsche sees as this driving instinct beneath the movement towards socialism, where will it inevitably manifest itself? Obviously within the state. And then, as we've been pointing out, because the value system is based on creating contentment, and it's also cutting off all of, therefore, these avenues of pain or strife or challenge that are avenues of self-overcoming, creates this neurosis of well-being where both in the super rich and in the socialists, we want very badly to get away from it. And we need an outlet for our will to power, right? We need some way for it to vent. And so where will that vent? It will inevitably manifest itself in the state as well. That's where it will find a vent. That will be the last remaining place. In the proletarian desire to make himself free of all constraints, to be free of duty that he owed in former ages to the aristocrats, break free of, being a wage slave, and to even think himself free of the political party, right? Because nobody wants to think that they're, under the boot heel of an authoritarian regime, even as it becomes all-encompassing and all-powerful, right? The one thing that he'll see himself constrained to is that moral duty to maximize the well-being of all mankind, the happiness of all mankind, that one principle. That becomes his binding ought, which the state then becomes the incarnation of on earth. It's quite the same way that Kant thought of the state, right? As the incarnation of his moral thinking. The state completely mirrors the categorical imperative in every way. And so Nietzsche writes about this in The Gay Science, Part 1, Section 5, quote, "He who feels himself dishonored at the thought of being the instrument of a prince, or of a party and sect, or even of wealthy power, for example, as the descendant of a proud ancient family, but who wishes just to be this instrument, or must be so before himself and before the public, such a person has the need of pathetic principles which can at all times be appealed to, principles of an unconditional ought, to which a person can subject himself without shame and can show himself subjected. All more refined servility holds fast to the categorical imperative." End quote. So obviously, Kant's deontological form of morality is typically considered to be opposed to utilitarianism and vice versa. That's not really what interests us here, though, because we're not concerned with the rational first principles. We're talking about an underlying feeling that Nietzsche is talking about. It's like a form of faith, this desire for the majority of human beings to surrender their will, to abdicate to some higher principle, to escape the power relationships of the hierarchy, therefore, by imposing some sort of universal law upon all men, which means we're all subjected to this principle. No one can be the instrument of a prince or a party or a wealthy power any longer. And so the key thing in invoking Kant is our modern sense of universalism that's reflected in Kant and the Kantian idea of subordinating everyone so that all can gain freedom or gain rights, however you want to understand it, right? We might recall the way that Nietzsche speaks about Socrates in the Twilight of Idols section, The Problem of Socrates, that dialectic and, the Socratic method of sort of dialectically cross-examining people and subjecting everyone to the culling blade of logic, right? He says that dialectic is always the knife thrust that is in the hands of the lower classes and the people who are out of power in society. The people who are truly powerful don't have to give reasons or explanations for the way that they act or believe. That's sort of the privilege of power, is not having to explain yourself. And that Socrates wields the dialectic in a sense as a universal, right? Logic is another universal law to which all people, regardless of their place in the hierarchy, become subjected. And therefore, again, Socrates is a plebeian, he's a man of the lower classes. And so naturally he would wield such a universal principle in order to level the hierarchy, because it stands to benefit Socrates to do so, because he's not one of the people who successfully climbed the hierarchy, right? So the modern faith in well-being is one of those universal oughts. It's a universal moral ought. Everyone shall yield up their will to the faith and the happiness of all mankind, and then therefore we're all preserved against the suffering that might be caused if our various wills were just allowed to sort of manifest their mutually hostile aims and have conflict with one another. So it's another principle of leveling, of sort of attempting to break down the hierarchy by subjecting everyone to one principle. The problem is that this will not actually work for the reasons that we'll talk about in another passage that I find brilliant in Daybreak, section 184. It has to do with the state becoming the only outlet for will to power, because obviously a principle can't actually rule. This is sort of the point I've been driving at, right? It has to be reified in order to actually subject everyone to it. And so, if Socrates is wielding the dialectical knife thrust as a way of, leveling the hierarchy in terms of the philosophical realm, in terms of the dialogue, in terms of ideas, Plato is then the frustrated utopian, his student who comes along and wants to actually implement the Socratic ideal politically in the world, right? And he actually attempts to do this over in Syracuse. So in a similar fashion, right, the yearning for freedom, the yearning to be free of all constraints of the anarchists and the socialists and the people who are promising to bring man freedom by delivering him from class and property and so on and so forth, they are actually, because they're preaching this one principle that will sort of level that hierarchy and that we can all subject ourselves to in order to benefit collectively, that's going to actually manifest in the form of a state. And Nietzsche here, his argument makes sense of why there are so many self-described, anarcho-communists who are more than willing to advocate for the most stringent uses of state power, the most authoritarian means in order to achieve their ends, right? The anarchist who claims a stateless utopia as their ultimate goal, but invokes whatever means of state power are possible for them to get what they want in the here and now. So Nietzsche writes, quote, "In countries inhabited by tractable men, there are always a few backsliders and intractable people. For the present, the latter have joined the socialists more than any other party. If it should happen that these people once come to have the making of the laws, they may be relied upon to impose iron chains upon themselves and to practice a dreadful discipline. They know themselves, and they will endure these harsh laws with the knowledge that they themselves have imposed them. The feeling of power and of this particular power will be too recent among them and too attractive for them not to suffer anything for its sake." End quote. Very prescient passage, right? So the only outlet for our will to power once capitalism develops to this point of bringing forth socialism will be advancement through bureaucratic institutions, being entrusted with some measure of state power, right? The state will become the repository of all human value. And as we know from Nietzsche's past writings that we've discussed, from the early period, he sees in the state a danger that the state always wishes to preserve and keep things the same. It's the same issue we've been talking about, right? The state is a power that always attempts to maintain that status quo. Stability is what the state, in some sense, is trying to create. It's its raison d'etre. It makes itself an enemy of cultural development for this reason. This tendency of the state is useful because preserving culture, it carries some form of benefit, right? It stops all the cultural developments from being swept away in anarchistic dissolution. But the danger of the state is always that it will ossify and halt all new change, all development, right? And thus Nietzsche's problem with the state is in this very eventuality that the state will become an end instead of a means, right? That the iron clamp of the state, so useful in compressing the will to power from this, it compresses it down from an outright war into the competition between geniuses. But this iron clamp will continue to clamp down, and it'll become inflexible. It'll clamp down too hard. It'll begin to crush against anything or anyone that threatens the intractable logic of this system, which is to ever more finely tune the system to well-being, ever more powerfully fortify itself against any instability or unpredictability, make things the same forever. And I think we can see as a result of this type of moral and political outlook, the stance that socialists take regarding the worker or the proletarian, the person who sells his labor for a wage, as the driving force of the revolution and the most important class of society are the workers, the cogs in the machine, right? And it's the exact opposite of what the Greeks thought in antiquity, as Nietzsche talks about, that the Greek value system it doesn't see existence or the continuation of existence in and of itself as a good, and therefore, since work is simply a necessary means of maintaining our existence, it can't ever really be celebrated. And so in this idea of attaining the perfect state, however, this perfect state, this equilibrium of stability, the workers, the cogs in the machine that maintain it, since there's no goal beyond simply maintaining it, now become the ideal figures in society. And so even though the attainment of like a classless state of society is the goal of the socialists, the revolutionary subject for them is the worker. And we also saw historically, you can see it in the propaganda of the Soviets and the Maoists, the exaltation of the worker as a heroic figure, right? The hero is no longer the extraordinary person. The hero is the ordinary person. So the warrior, the aristocrat, etc., those figures are done. The hero is the laborer. And so it's a complete inversion of the ancient Greek value system. And so in a sense, it's another reason why Nietzsche sees this as like the final harvest of the Christian religion's revaluation of values, is that what is most common becomes the most idealized. The ideal is the average. So Nietzsche discusses this in Daybreak, number 173, quote, "The flatterers of work. In the glorification of work and the never-ceasing talk about the blessing of labor, I see the same secret arrière-pensée as I do in the praise bestowed on impersonal acts of a general interest, a fear of everything individual. For at the sight of work, that is to say, severe toil from morning till night, we have the feeling that it is the best police, that it holds everyone in check and effectively hinders the development of reason, of greed, and of desire for independence. For work uses up an extraordinary proportion of nervous force, withdrawing it from reflection, meditation, dreams, cares, love, and hatred. It dangles unimportant aims before the eyes of the worker and affords easy and regular gratification. Thus it happens that a society where work is continually being performed will enjoy greater security, and it is security which is now venerated as the supreme deity. And now, horror of horrors, it is the workman himself who has become dangerous. The whole world is swarming with dangerous individuals, and behind them follow the danger of dangers, the individuum. End quote. So much here in this passage. We have security as the supreme deity, so comfort, safety, well-being, basically synonyms in some sense, right? The workman is the most dangerous type of man. He's the revolutionary class, so of course he is. And the supposed freedom that the socialist thinks he'll create from freeing the laborer from the onerous power relationships, or a more just distribution of property, or eventually a propertyless society, whatever it might be, that will only be harnessed by people who have been made more and more average by idealizing the average worker as the most valuable and heroic type of man, by people who have come to see their value in society, right? They've come to see the most valuable way of realizing their will to power, insofar as they are flattered as workers, as the driving engine of society's productivity, people who identify themselves with being a function, right? And therefore, what follows from this state of supposedly attained freedom isn't a sort of saturnalia of all these individuals manifesting individual and peculiar wills, but an individuum, an indivisible entity, a smoothed over society, a giant production line in which everyone gives up their individuality. Once everyone's been freed from all these unjust seeming forms of subjugation, right, to a political party or the rich or to a nation, the vast majority still needs something to feel subject to give up their will to. They identify it with the moral principle. The moral principle is the pleasure of all. Everyone therefore lives for pleasure. That is the ideal and inexorable logic of that system. We honor the workers as the hero of this system, as the people who maintain it. And simply preserving our existence becomes the most heroic thing that you can do. And thus the end of everyone maximizing their individual freedom is atomization, which means we're not really a collective, nor are we individuals. We're just sort of an individuum. And that means death. It means stasis, because life is a moving thing, a growing thing. And without somewhere else to go, somewhere higher to go, life is over. And so Nietzsche's problem with utopia, it's not that he thinks we can't progress to something that's quote-unquote better. He writes in Human All Too Human, in fact, that progress is neither impossible nor inevitable. It's possible, but not guaranteed, right? His problem with utopia is the positing of a final state. Utopia isn't just the idea things can get better. It's the idea of stasis. That's always contained in the idea of utopia. And so while people usually think of utopianism as like a super progressive way of viewing the world, underneath it is a kind of like, what would you call it? Like a wistful conservatism in the idea that there is a perfect state, and that if it were ever achieved, one would then simply do everything in their power to preserve it, that there would be nowhere to go from there. And so for Nietzsche, nothing makes less sense than that, that you can't ever imagine a final state for life because life doesn't exist in frozen dead states. Whatever problems we solve today will only lead to more complex problems. And we're all the better for that, right? Thank God that that's true, because having no problems is itself a problem. And that is the problem with utopia, paradoxical as it is. With nowhere to go, no meaningful way to exercise our power, we don't find contentment. Contentment is kind of a contradiction in terms, in a sense, of being happy perpetually, because the very idea of perpetual happiness is another wood and iron. This is a note sounded nowhere more powerfully than it is in Thus Spoke Zarathustra on the way of the creator. Remember that division of man into creature and creator, right? Zarathustra asks his followers, quote, "You call yourself free? Your dominant thought I want to hear, and not that you have escaped from a yoke. Are you one of those who had the right to escape from a yoke? There are some who threw away their last value when they threw away their servitude. Free from what? As if that mattered to Zarathustra. But your eyes should tell me brightly, free for what?" End quote. So all those bonds, social bonds and duties and obligations you wanted to throw away in the name of making yourself more free, if you don't actually have the power to direct your will towards something, you will just be smoothed over and atomized. And it was actually all those constraints that allowed people in past ages to occasionally do great things or make themselves better than they were. So with all this in mind, we'll look at one final passage, and this is from Daybreak. I think this brings together many of these ideas into an explicit criticism of the modern world and the direction in which it's proceeding. This is a long one, and I'll interrupt the quotation a couple times to give some commentary. So this is Daybreak 206, entitled The Impossible Class. Quote, "Poverty, cheerfulness, and independence. It is possible to find these three qualities combined in one individual. Poverty, cheerfulness, and slavery, this is likewise a possible combination, and I can say nothing better to the workmen who serve as factory slaves, presuming that it does not appear to them altogether to be a shameful thing to be utilized as they are, as the screws of a machine, and the stopgaps, as it were, of the human spirit of invention. Fie on the thought that merely by means of higher wages the essential part of their misery, i.e. their personal enslavement, might be removed. Fie that we should allow ourselves to be convinced that by an increase of this impersonality within the mechanical workings of a new society, the disgrace of slavery could be changed into a virtue. Fie that there should be a regular price at which man should cease to be a personality and become a screw instead. Are you accomplices in the present madness of nations, which desire above all to produce as much as possible, and to be as rich as possible? Would it not be your duty to present a counterclaim to them, and to show them what large sums of internal value are wasted in the pursuit of such an external object?" End quote. I'm going to jump in the passage here. Nietzsche identifies that common thread between capitalism and socialism yet again. The madness of all nations is to produce as much as possible and become as rich as possible. The only difference between capitalist and socialist economies is simply whether it's on the individual or the collective level, right? Material prosperity is always the highest goal. And he has an insight that this wastes our internal value, our potential for self-overcoming and transformation when we focus on the pursuit of external objects, as though these will be a substitute for that. And that for Nietzsche, it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about an entire national harnessing of the productive forces in order to equitably provide things like energy and healthcare and food, maybe even some luxuries too, you never know. As you might say, that's the goal of socialism, right? Or whether we're simply talking about a rich businessman who seeks to secure as much luxury and a nice house and a security system and as much, pleasure and stability as he can possibly manage. That in both cases, the God you're serving is gold, and the model of mankind you're using is the homo economicus, and that's why capitalism always flows into socialism, because ultimately there are simply more people who would benefit all the more from socialism on the material level, right? And so he says, to hell with the idea that mere higher wages will ameliorate their misery, that will satisfy their ennui. To hell with the idea of setting a price on the value of what a human life is worth. There's kind of a double meaning here, right? He's saying on some level, you could take it as a very actually prescient critique of what you might call sort of like social democracy as a bulwark against the final end of socialism, because he's kind of saying the idea of raising wages or setting a minimum wage will not actually stop this internal logic from continuing to play out. But importantly, to some extent, the socialists themselves can't get away from this logic either. Even as they want to deny that they would, say, put a price on the worker, right? Realistically speaking, how can any system ameliorate the conditions of the workers except by redistributing resources, goods, luxuries out of the hands of the upper class and into the hands of the proletarians? It simply will have to be done at some point, right? And eventually, whether you choose to actually quantify that or not in terms of a price, if you follow the idea of from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, and keep going to the ultimate conclusions of that, in whatever the economic system is, right? Whatever the total wealth is in the system, you're going to have to determine what percentage each worker of each kind is owed for their labor, of what is actually fair. The collective of labor of the laboring classes will have to determine that. You might say the logic of the market isn't setting a price, but they will also set a price, right? And Nietzsche's saying even that will not satisfy their will to power. That will not be a substitute for internal development, the external material situation of the laborers, no matter what it is. The other aspect which is interesting here is the link to the essay, The Greek State, and the observation that labor was the most shameful thing in antiquity, as we've talked about. And remember that he says there's something that we could call an advantage over the Greeks by means of our illusions, which christen labor as something valuable and laudatory. And that's what he says. It's actually quite possible for him to imagine somebody who is poor and who is cheerful and who is a slave, right? Whereas you couldn't imagine that in the Greek world, and it's due to the illusions that we have in the modern world. Now, back to the passage, he says, quote, "But where is your internal value when you no longer know what it is to breathe freely? When you have scarcely any command over your own selves, and often feel disgusted with yourselves as with some stale food? When you zealously study the newspapers and look enviously at your wealthy neighbor, made covetous by the rapid rise and fall of power, money, and opinions? When you no longer believe in a philosophy in rags, or in the freedom of spirit of a man who has few needs? When a voluntary and idyllic poverty without profession or marriage, such as should suit the more intellectual ones among you, has become for you an object of derision? On the other hand, the piping of the socialistic rat-catchers who wish to inspire you with foolish hopes is continually sounding in your ears. They tell you to be ready and nothing further, ready from this day to the next, so that you wait and wait for something to come from outside, though living in all other respects as you lived before, until this waiting is at length changed into hunger and thirst and fever and madness, and the clay of the bestia triumphans at last dawns in all its glory. Every one of you should, on the contrary, say to himself, it would be better to emigrate and endeavor to become a master in new and savage countries, especially to become master over myself, changing my place of abode whenever the least sign of slavery threatens me, endeavoring to avoid neither adventure nor war, and if things come to the worst, holding myself ready to die. Anything rather than continuing in this state of disgraceful thraldom, this bitterness, malice, and rebelliousness. This would be the proper spirit. The workmen in Europe ought to make it clear that their position as a class has become a human impossibility, and not merely, as they at present maintain, the result of some hard and aimless arrangement of society. They should bring about an age of great swarming forth from the European beehive, such as has never been seen, protesting by this voluntary and huge migration against machines and capital, and the alternatives that now threaten them either of becoming slaves of the state or slaves of some revolutionary party." End quote. So Nietzsche is saying, don't believe these people, these socialistic rat catchers, when they tell you that by improving your material well-being, it will be a substitute or some sort of compensation that will actually justify becoming a screw in some machine of production. That being part of this machine of production, of gaining wealth, whether on the whatever level it is, right, for the proletariat, for the happiness of all mankind, or just for yourself, will never be a substitute for your inner development. And so he's advocating for rebelling against this on a large scale, not revolting and trying to take over the means of production, because that's just still following the same internal logic that you can be happy as one of those cogs in the machine. That's just going to make you a slave to the state or a slave to some party. And so none of that will make you happy. beyond the mere fulfillment of creature needs, the mere creature comforts, right? We might say. And so Nietzsche says the best thing for you, dear European laborer of the 19th century, is not to listen to the dreams of the socialist, who's simply continuing down that same utilitarian course of modernity, that same internal logic that's making everyone a screw in the machine, and that will place everyone under this inflexible clamp of the state. Instead, go swarm out into the world. Go to some hard foreign land. Go to some wilderness. Go somewhere that's not been tamed, where few or no people live. Go adopt some hard, challenging, dangerous task. And I think it could be easy to interpret this in light of, the concern today about colonialism and see this passage as deeply problematic or something. I don't actually think that's the tack Nietzsche is taking here. I mean, remember, we started with a passage where Nietzsche said the civilizations of Mexico and Peru are superior to our own, superior to the cultures of Spain and the conquistadors. So the point isn't for Europeans to go out and dominate other ethnicities or take their land. I think, if anything, he'd prefer you to go to some land that no one thinks is valuable, that no one has a claim on, and go settle there, right? I mean, you could say it's a problem for us today that no such land really exists unless you want to be really, really cold. But Nietzsche might say, so much the better. Go be really, really cold. You want to be free, right? That's the place to go. Go to Nunavut or Antarctica or something, right? There's a great documentary by Werner Herzog about people who go work down at that base in Antarctica, and I can't remember exactly what it's called now. It's the one with the famous scene about him talking about the mad penguin wandering off to his doom or whatever. But the documentary is basically about the people who work there, not just scientists, but people who drive trucks and do transport and all sorts of things. Maybe another good example that I've used before, which I think encapsulates Nietzsche's problem with utopianism, is the example of Star Trek, and especially the original series. I actually wrote a whole essay on this topic about why it's my thesis on Star Trek, right? That I haven't heard anyone else really put forward. But why I think Star Trek is actually a rejection of utopianism. It's not a vision of utopia, as has often been said. I'll link this in the show notes. I may have mentioned it before, but the gist of the argument, without going into the nerdy specifics, if you don't care about any of that, is this. In Star Trek, we have a human race that has conquered hunger. It's conquered racial and ethnic inequality and injustice. It has total equality of the sexes. It's mastered technology to a degree where mankind basically has free energy, and so everyone has even most luxuries. It's all trivially easy to obtain, right? Not even to speak of basic needs. But the show isn't about a human race without problems, right? Their problems just exist on a grander scale than our problems, right? And furthermore, the show doesn't really spend any time on Earth in the supposedly utopian society. Why? Well, because that's not interesting to us as the audience, which says something very interesting about the audience, right? What we want is to see the heroes out where? On the frontier, right? That's why Star Trek was conceived as a Western in space. That's why space is called the final frontier at the beginning of the opening monologue or whatever. It's a never-ending expanse of cold, hard, unsettled territory for the heroes to explore. And in the show, they're always meeting colonists and people who have struck out from the apparently ideal conditions on Earth. And it's counterintuitive, right, if you think about it, based on all the values that we've been enculturated to hold. Why would you leave the utopia for a hard, challenging life on settling on an asteroid or something, right? But with all the considerations that we've brought up, it makes perfect sense. People will not be satisfied with simply sitting around with all their creature needs fulfilled as if they were a piano key. They want to constantly take on danger and challenge and employ or manifest their power, their competency in the world, and become better and transform themselves into something better. So that's my thesis on Star Trek, right? It's a show about how there is no utopia and how we constantly want to be pushing out onto the frontier and encountering new challenges and difficulties. So the vision of society that's being created now and fostered by the socialists to Nietzsche is something for which the only antidote is a competing vision of life. And so even though it's not really a practicable political program to just be send all the laborers out to colonize the rest of the world and go live in Arctic regions in the rainforest or whatever. It's not, practical at all, but he's at least attempting to give us this competing vision of life on the frontier, to simply go sidestep the whole political dialectic right now and the issue of restructuring the polity, which is all based on the same underlying logic. And he points out instead, your degree of hedonistic pleasure will never bring you contentment. Utopia will never be found. You shouldn't even look for a final state, because that's kind of like looking for, it's a dead end, right? Look for the ways in which you yourself can continually overcome challenges and subject yourself to hardship as part of a process of transformation. And so that was a very long interjection. There's still a little bit more of this passage from Daybreak, so we'll finish the passage now before wrapping up the episode. Quote, "May Europe be freed from 1/4 of her inhabitants. Both she and they will experience a sensation of relief. It is only far in the distance, in the undertaking of vast colonizations, that we shall be able to observe how much rationality, fairness, and healthy suspicion Mother Europe has incorporated in her sons. These sons who could no longer endure life in the home of the dull old woman, always running the danger of becoming as bad-tempered, irritable, and pleasure-seeking as she herself. The European virtues will travel along with these workmen far beyond the boundaries of Europe. And these very qualities, which on their native soil had begun to degenerate into a dangerous discontent and criminal inclinations, will, when abroad, be transformed into a beautiful savage naturalness and will be called heroism, so that at last a purer air would again be wafted over this old, overpopulated, and brooding Europe of ours. What would it matter if there was a scarcity of hands? Perhaps people would then recollect that they had accustomed themselves to many wants merely because it was easy to gratify them. It would be sufficient to unlearn some of these wants. Perhaps also Chinamen would be called in, and these would bring with them their modes of living and thinking, which would be found very suitable for industrious ants. They would also perhaps help to imbue this fretful and restless Europe with some of their Asiatic calmness and contemplation, and what is perhaps most needful of all, their Asiatic stability." End quote. So, outdated racial remarks aside, we can take Nietzsche's perspective here as essentially applying to what we might call like the cultural consciousness of Europe versus that of, say, China. That he perceives in their cultural consciousness something that's more long-sighted, maybe like a naturally collectivist outlook from the people of China, which would help like break down the cultural provincialism in Europe, like what Nietzsche talked about in some of the sections we mentioned before in A Glance at the State. This, speed along this process of the destruction of European nations and bringing forth one European identity. Setting Nietzsche's perhaps odd views about immigration aside, I think the most important part of this passage is these lines. Quote, "What would it matter if there was a scarcity of hands? Perhaps people would then recollect that they had accustomed themselves to many wants merely because it was easy to gratify them. It would be sufficient to unlearn some of these wants." End quote. And that's the kind of passage, it unifies Nietzsche's critique of socialism and capitalism, that both flourish with an abundance of labor, right? They're sort of historically stages of advancement that have come out of surplus and abundance, right? Allowing one system to transcend, sublate into another system, and with a clamoring for an increase in the quality of life that would have been unthinkable to people for the vast majority of human history. And it really is impossible for us to imagine how differently people lived before the Industrial Revolution, which is not that long ago. The hardship that daily life consisted of, how many children died before the age of 1, How much pain have we already removed from the human condition, and thus how much pleasure or how much happiness have we made unreachable now? It's something we don't ever think about, but maybe we should think about it, just to be aware of it, right? It seems now that the laissez-faire system was a brief moment in time. It only made sense at that particular stage of technology, that particular stage of social development. But now, as we've progressed and technology has allowed for possibilities that no one ever dreamed of, digital currencies, digital surveillance, information networks that span the globe, bureaucracies with records so expansive and precise that no one from the 19th century could have conceived of it, we're seeing almost like a natural development that all these countries have more or less adopted a mixed system. And that's as true of formerly capitalist countries as it is of formerly communist countries, and even avowedly communist countries, right? Only we discover now that Marx was simply incorrect about the proletariat being the revolutionary subject, just as he was incorrect about the first communist revolutions. He said they would occur in the most industrial developed countries. Instead, it took hold in formerly feudal societies. It produced governments ruled not by the people, but by a closed-off political elite, rather than the state withering away like a burden that could just eventually be slaked off. Again, that's what Marx predicted, but instead the state became all-powerful in these socialistic experiments, which seems to indicate that Nietzsche's view of human nature was perhaps more accurate. When we look at the history of the communist regimes, the complexities of them are such that, I don't know, I don't think we'll glean much that's useful in arguing over whose theories were best realized, right? But it's worth noting that when the Soviets put forward something like a theory of the overman, of the new Soviet man, that was partially inspired by Nietzsche, and that their idea was that when man went beyond the limitations of capitalism, he would himself be transformed into a better type of human being. So that aspect is there, but it's coming from an influence that seems to be outside Marx and somewhat irreconcilable with him. We might also note that figures such as Stalin and Mao and Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il-sung, they all incorporated nationalistic policies and sort of culturally provincial ideas into their implementations of communism. And in many interpretations of the history of communist regimes, that was often what held them together or what saved them in some sense. It never manifested in that form of actually delivering freedom to the proletariat at large. Maybe that's inevitable. Maybe it will always be that the realities of power politics will always subvert the goal of the socialists. It might not even be any fault of their own. But, I don't know. I think talking too much about the new Soviet man might, given the time code we're already at in the episode, might take us a little too far afield, but maybe that'll be a topic I could discuss in the future. I don't know. In any way, I guess we'll just wrap up by saying I think it's debatable whether the markets become freer or more stringently regulated. Few could argue against that proposition. The state has gained in power, right? It would seem to me to be definitely the direction that we're headed in as just a function of new technology, if no other reason. And there's that sense that if there's one thing above everyone, it's the law, right? And the surveillance powers of the modern state are just, and their capacities to disseminate information and control it are so much greater than anyone in Nietzsche's time would have imagined. And so what we live in is not what Marx predicted. It's not the kind of capitalism Adam Smith was talking about. It is, in many respects, what Nietzsche at least indicated by his criticisms of socialism, though, a society managed for the well-being of all, with an all-powerful state and a universalizing morality. And it seems like, again, this weird utilitarian hybrid. It's not really described by any, ideology from the 19th century. What we see is this ever hardening, ever self-preserving technocratic state that always finds more efficient ways to shore up the edges against any volatility. It doesn't seem as though it has proceeded towards revolution. It's, all the apparently socialist revolutions, in fact, produced states that then went in the opposite direction. They all have given way towards a movement back towards this state that we've described, right? This technocratic state. And so whether one thinks that the state or the corporations are the ruling power, for example, one can't help but notice that the distinction between them seems to blur more and more every day. They all seem to operate according to this managerial logic. And so, I don't know. I think in some sense, this is all just to say that I think the debate between capitalism or socialism is a little bit outdated. I don't think the labels really work anymore. When we find people who are staunch defenders of either, they seem to us like relics of an earlier age. That being said, if we express socialism in the broadest sense as this desire to use the state to achieve well-being for the greatest many, I hope I've given a comprehensible enough understanding of why Nietzsche would have a an opposition to that, why he would be suspicious of that end. His answer, however, is not reaction. It's not even revolution. It's to turn away, to go another direction entirely. Go seek your own frontier. That's where your goals should be, not in political idealism. So hopefully that made sense, and hopefully all the disagreement with these series of episodes will be intellectual and respectful and used as food for thought rather than, as people getting mad because I insulted their particular ideological agenda or whatever. In any case, that's all for this week. I hope to see everyone next time, or hope everyone tunes in, for Nietzsche Contra Fascism. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.